We may have solved the puzzle that has been perplexing the Biden campaign all year. I'm Scott Ott with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green. This episode of Right Angle is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. And gentlemen, there's a new study out by some economists that may answer the question of how is it possible that the economy is going so well and inflation is coming down, and yet people don't seem to realize it. While the Biden administration touts their economic record, you find people in key areas of the country that he'll rely on to win the election this fall. They don't see it that way. The study actually showed that in metro areas with more Republicans and independents, there actually was higher inflation in 2022, this is when the research was compiled, than places where Democrats live. In other words, the people that are kind of on the fence or in the middle or Republicans who are thinking, hey, am I going to go and vote for Trump or not, are being influenced by higher inflation rates. The Biden administration is saying, wait a minute, but inflation is down. What the research is showing is not where I live. And there are a couple of reasons for this, Steve, and I'll enumerate a couple of them, and you tell me what you think of these ideas. First of all, there's a phenomenon with inflation. Inflation is largely a mental condition. If a lot of people believe that there is inflation, then they tend to take actions consistent with inflation. Or if they believe inflation is escalating, they tend to do that. That workers who are afraid they won't have enough money to spend will demand higher wages. Companies that are selling stuff, when they see that inflation train coming down the track, they will jack up their prices in preparation for it. And so there's a mental aspect that becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. But in 7 swing states, they did a survey in 7 swing states, and they found that people said that inflation was going the wrong direction, Steve. But from February 23 to February 24, inflation in those states decreased on average from 6% to 3.2%. How much of this do you think is a perception issue that becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy? It's always a political issue. I mean, everybody who's a Republican says things were worse when the Democrats were in charge and vice versa. But in this case, it looks like the expectation that inflation is going to be bad in the Republican-leaning areas or independent areas tends to be self-fulfilling, and it actually is bad.
Well, there are several different angles to this. I'll try and touch on at least 2 of them here. One is wages for most workers still hasn't caught up with inflation. So not only are we behind, where we were in 2021 when Biden was sworn in and before inflation took off in April of that year, but we have missed out on 3+ years of wage growth, which is a horrible sinking feeling. And when you look at the areas where inflation has hit the hardest, things that people enjoy like grocery shopping or hitting the McDonald's drive-thru, or you want to buy a house, these are the areas where inflation has hit the absolute worst, and it doesn't matter what part of the country you're in. So these are genuine pocketbook issues, and it doesn't really matter if the rate of inflation is less than it was at its height in 2022. What matters is your wages still haven't caught up with it. And if you're talking about the broad middle class, there was a Wall Street Journal report last week, I believe, Scott, that showed if you adjust for inflation, household wealth under Biden has in 3.5 years gone up 0.7%. 0.7%. So again, and by the way, in that same period, in Trump's first 3 years before the pandemic, it went up 16%. So Trump performed about 30 times roughly better than Biden has in terms of household wealth. So these are real issues. People aren't going, I think there's inflation. No, we have lost 3 years of raises. We have lost 3 years of earnings in our retirement accounts. These are very real things. Groceries are still way too expensive. They're taking up a bigger chunk of our paycheck than they have in decades. So this is not a perception issue. This is a real, genuine issue. That said, This gets to the second part that I wanted to touch on. You mentioned how inflation is hit harder in areas that tend to be more Republican or more independent than Democrat areas. And I immediately pictured not the map of red states and blue states, but the map of red counties versus blue counties. And you look at the red counties, and they cover a huge swath of the nation, almost the entire middle of it. And the blue counties, which have a lot of people in them, granted, but those blue counties tend to be very concentrated along the coast, Chicago, Detroit, your
now,
major urban
Steve,
centers.
they are
in the
looking
middle.
at metro areas in this study, though. They're not just looking at across the country.
Well, yeah, but the urban part is where inflation has hit the worst because rents are already high in places like New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. Gas is already higher in those places than it is anywhere else in the country, and so on. So inflation was less apparent in those places that already tend to vote Democrat than it is in the rest of the country. So not only is this much more than a perception issue, but it has been most noticeable, perceived, I suppose you might say, in those areas that Biden needs to win swing voters.
Yeah, and Bill, that's the heart of this this idea. The import of this research is basically this is really bad news for Joe Biden because there are a couple of other phenomena going on. For example, migration toward red states or cities that are more Republican or independent leaning is greater. And so housing is increasing in price faster than it might be in a place that's bleeding population or that's just static. And so prices go up that are connected with housing. Everything becomes more expensive around housing. Also, in red areas, it's more likely that people do more of their transportation in personal vehicles. And so a lot more gasoline is a much bigger part of their budget. And it's also a very noticeable part of the economy because every corner you drive past, you know what the rate of gas is. It was as if you were driving down the street and the Dow Jones Industrial Average was being flashed from every sign at every intersection. So it's an indicator that people are very conscious of when it comes to that. If you look at this, Bill, I think Biden's got a huge problem here because really, as we know, it's going to come down to a few swing states. And in these swing states, it's not just perception that inflation is worse. It's actually worse.
Well, if things keep going the way they're going, one of those swing states is going to be New York. So, look,
Must be nice.
Whether it's fair or not, and there is some degree of justice in this, people measure the economy by presidencies. The question is always, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? So if you say that it was 6%, now it's 3%, I don't know how long that time period is.
1 year, February 23 to 24.
So people aren't measuring it by the year, they're measuring it by the 4 years. And so you have to ask yourself, what is the actual price of things compared to 4 years ago? And this is where Biden just gets creamed. I think it's a fair statement to say that the political punditry and our overlord ruling class, I don't know how else to phrase this, so I'll just phrase it the way it comes to me. They can afford inflation. They're not on such a tight income that they can't afford to pay another 15, 20, 30% on top of things. But for the average guy, you mentioned it, Scott, and Steve mentioned it too. The two examples that I was going to say is, with the exception of the rich in this country, two experiences that most all of us have are pumping gas and occasionally at least going through the drive-thru at McDonald's. And in those cases, it is simply shocking. I mean, apple pie and a Coke, it'll be $9. It's just really, really bad. And so what seems to be happening is that Biden is basically trying to say this horrific problem is less bad than it used to be. Hey, isn't that grand? But people aren't comparing it to a year ago, and they're not comparing it even to the height of the inflation. They're comparing it to what things were like when the other guy was in office, because the other guy's back on the ticket again. And the nice thing, to the degree that there's something nice about inflation, the one thing about inflation that I think is most germane to this discussion, why it is such a big problem for Biden, is you can't spin inflation. You can't spin it. You can tell people they should be happier or sadder about what the government is doing about global warming or about the threat from nuclear weapons. All of these things are abstract. going to a drive-in at McDonald's or grocery shopping or buying gas is something that everybody has to do multiple times a month. And that's a case of who are you going to believe, Joe Biden or your own lying eyes? And he's in real trouble in this regard, and I don't see him getting out of it. And furthermore, I think he's earned it too. By the way, let's not forget that when they decide to pump a couple $1 trillion into the economy to stimulate the economy, it's an absolute mystery why that would cause prices to go up. I mean, it's just no one could have predicted, right? We were talking about this 3 years ago.
Well, living in Texas, I'm certainly, I get to be on the receiving end of that great migratory wave that's coming in from all over the country and frankly all over the world. People moving here, and I'm one of the many people kicking myself that I didn't buy real estate 10 years ago when it was, now it seems like it was cheap. At the time, it didn't seem that cheap. And so, I've seen rents and mortgages go up here in Texas as we become more in demand. The supply is only so much, and so the price increases. There is a mental and emotional phenomenon behind movements of markets and behind inflation. That doesn't mean it's fictitious; it's real. But there is an emotional expectation that goes that when people think something is going to happen, they act in ways consistent with that thing happening, and through that activity among countless thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of people, that eventuality comes to pass in a market because everybody's behaving in a way consistent with that. Oddly enough, and it's not just during this most recent administration, but Republicans have a much dimmer view of the future of inflation than do Democrats. Maybe Democrats are being naive, maybe Republicans are being a little doomsdayish, but for whatever reason, it may be because in these major metro areas, Republicans are actually seeing worse results than Democrats are where they live. In either case, in the places that matter, Joe Biden has a big problem on his hands in this regard, and it's the economy, stupid, and people aren't stupid. And they will look at this and they will say, look, I don't care what's happening in all those other places. I care what's happening where I live. All politics is local. And so far, backing the Biden horse hasn't gotten us to the finish line any faster. We're ready to change horses. For Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making Right Angle possible.